Welcome back to the Apologetics series. I'm very passionate about this topic. We're looking at evidence for Christianity. Last video we talked about why I'm a Christian. I said because it's true, and what is a Christian. But today is why am I a Christian? And I'm a Christian because of the evidence, and there is indeed evidence for Christianity. I can find some in the Bible and outside of the Bible. We're going to start with in the Bible first. For comparison's sake, when we look at the Bible, we see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are the Gospels, as we call them, and they talk about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Those are four accounts, four biographies of Jesus. Let's look at someone like Alexander the Great, whom in our history classes we would have all remembered something about Alexander the Great. He had a couple biographies written about him, but his were hundreds of years later. All of the biographies about Jesus, if you believe what biblical scholars say, or even many secular scholars, were written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. That's important, because with Alexander the Great, they were not. They were passed down, almost like the game telephone, for multiple hundreds of years, and then eventually written down. So we don't know exactly what happened with Alexander the Great, or someone like Caesar. Another cool thing about the New Testament in the Bible, so this is Matthew through Revelation. All of these books are written by eyewitnesses of Jesus, and they're all written within the lifetime of the disciples. So we're talking Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. The book of Acts details the travels and the development of the early church. Then we have Romans through Philemon, which are either letters to early churches, or they're pastoral letters to Titus and Timothy, or it's a letter about why not to have slaves. But this is all very well documented. We see the same thing happen with the books of 1st and 2nd Peter, Hebrews, James, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude as well. These are all books that talk about the life of Jesus and how we're supposed to live because of that life. Now, Revelation is a little bit different. Revelation talks about the end of the world, and that's a harder book. It does not necessarily relate to the life of Jesus, but we do see, again, red letters in Revelation. Red letters are when Jesus speaks in the Bible. So those are important. We have to pay attention to those. But how do I know the Bible is reliable? I mean, some people will say it was just transferred like the game of telephone, like Alexander the Great was. And that's not accurate. We have what has been called an abundance of riches, or an embarrassment of riches, about the knowledge of the New Testament. See, something like Alexander the Great, they might have 6 or even 10 copies of what was written a couple hundred years later. But the beauty of the Bible is described in this acronym called M.E.R.E.T, M-E-R-E-T, multiple early recorded eyewitness testimonies. These were written down by multiple people within the lifetime of the authors, of the disciples, and they testify to the works and the good news of Jesus. But how many of these do we have? Well, this is cool. We have over 26,000. Sit with that for a minute. We have 10 copies of the works of Alexander the Great. We've got maybe 10, 20 copies of things like Caesar, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. With the Bible, we have 26,000. Whoa. That's an embarrassment of information compared to everyone else. We have 5,000 copies that are just written in Greek. 5,000. That means we have more copies in Greek than we do of any other historical figure. And Greek was the language of the original New Testament. We also have about 800 copies that are in Aramaic, which is another language that the disciples spoke. This is a well-documented historical event. Jesus was a historical figure. No one denies that. If you deny that, you are what is called wrong. And this is something that now secular historians agree on. We're going to go to this thing called minimal facts. Dr. Gary Habermas made this, and these are 5 statements that historical scholars who are biblical and non-biblical agree on. So even people who don't believe that Jesus is God believe in the following statements. Statement 1, they believe that Jesus existed and died on a Roman cross. 2, they believe that Jesus was buried in a private, well-marked tomb. 3, they believe that that tomb was found empty. 4, the disciples claimed to have an encounter with the risen Jesus. Obviously, if you're a biblical scholar, you believe that the disciples had an encounter with the risen Jesus, like we see in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 6. But if you're not a biblical scholar and you don't believe in Jesus, you at least believe that the disciples claimed to have an encounter with Jesus. And then the 5th minimum fact is that the disciples never recanted their belief in the resurrection of Jesus and Jesus' deity, his godness. There are also 2 bonus facts. And bonus fact number 1 talks about Paul and James. See, Paul was initially called Saul, and he actually persecuted the church. He tried to kill and successfully killed many Christians. In Acts 7, he was a witness to the death of the first Christian martyr, Stephen. But then he met God, he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, and became a Christian and wrote the majority of the New Testament. This is a mind-blowing transformation that could only reasonably have happened from a supernatural encounter. Let's talk about James, the half-brother of Jesus. He did not believe that his half-brother was God. I mean, what would it take for your brother, your half-brother, to say, oh yeah, he's God? Walk on water? Not good enough. Heal some people? I've seen doctors. No. Until Jesus rose from the dead, James did not believe he was God, not believe that Jesus was God. But once Jesus rose from the dead, then James believed. It's a very powerful witness there. Additionally, the church has been the largest global movement despite oppression. Despite a worldview that says abstain from sex until marriage, despite promised torture, despite the fact that you will be persecuted on earth, the church has always grown. It's now the largest global movement ever. My question to someone who does not believe is, do you have a better explanation for all 7 of those minimum facts? Not just for one. Because Muslims will say that Jesus had a twin, and Jesus didn't actually die. But there's no evidence for that. Also, the religion of Islam occurred 600 years, and it's based on an experience for a man in a cave, and there's a lot of holes in how Islam was developed. But we have eyewitness accounts to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Some people say Jesus didn't actually die. We have scientific evidence that happened to be recorded. It says in the Bible that when the soldiers speared Jesus' side, both water and blood poured out from his side. This is important because it means that your heart is no longer pumping, and you have a separation of fluids in your body. And when they separate, you are dead. This is also why it says in the Bible, they did not break his bones because he was clearly dead. See, there's a 0% success rate of crucifixion in Rome. You died. And if you somehow would have been alive afterwards, you were killed with a spear, and they broke your legs to accelerate your death, and they threw in a pile of bodies. And then the person who didn't make sure you were dead on the cross, they were killed. You did not survive a Roman crucifixion. There were also guards placed in front of the tomb. And it's recorded by historians that those guards experienced something that made them run away from the tomb. Whoa, why is that? Something had to have happened on what we call Easter morning. Also, the disciples, what do they gain by, if it is a lie that Jesus rose from the dead, what do they gain from saying that? Absolutely nothing. Because if Jesus is still in the tomb, we could just go to the tomb and say, actually, here's Jesus' body. These disciples are crazy. Let's just let them go out in the hills and do whatever crazy people do. Or someone could have said, yes, we've seen Jesus, and now we will kill him again. But Jesus only appears in specific times in the Bible after his resurrection because it was such a hostile environment. Jesus makes it very clear that he is God, that he claims to be God. And these minimum facts make it hard to explain why someone would go to their death to believe a lie. What we see in the 21st century, in my lifetime, I have lived during this war on terrorism. From Islamic extremists flying planes into the Twin Towers, into the Pentagon. I lived through that. I did not live in New York City or in Washington, D.C., but I lived through that event. And they died for something they were told, and they were that passionate about it. It's really interesting, though, because the disciples are dying for something that they have seen with their own eyes. Imagine telling someone who lived in New York City and watched the Twin Towers get hit and crumble. We're 25 years removed from that. Imagine telling someone that did not happen, you're lying to me and to yourself. They would say, no, I experienced it, I believed it. Even if all of the footage disappeared, if all the newspapers disappeared, they would still say, I believe it, I experienced it. As well as 3,000 other friends, or a handful of other friends. And that's what we see in the Bible. The Bible mentions over 500 witnesses, not by name, but as a number of witnesses to the event of Jesus' resurrection. I bring up 25 years because by AD 57 to 58, which is about 25 years after Jesus died, we have almost all of the New Testament written. And this is important because this would have been a fresh event in the disciples' minds. And it makes sense why we have some books of the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that don't exactly agree on who was at the tomb that day when the women found the empty tomb. It's 25 years later. It's 10 years later. I know the essential figures, Mary. Maybe there's another Mary, and there's a Joanna, and a Salome. But I don't remember exactly who was there. I know some people were there. I know it was more than just me. Having those controversies in a detective's mind, this is brought up in cold case Christianity, when you have witness accounts that are a little bit different from one another, it actually strengthens it and makes it more believable. It makes it seem less fabricated. Because if I were to fabricate a story, I would say, I am actually the best hero in this story, and when I, the disciple, the one that Jesus loved the most, got to the tomb, I was the first one there, and there were no women there before me. Instead, we see the opposite. We find embarrassing testimony about the disciples that they fell asleep when Jesus said, "Come with me," and while he was praying, the night he was betrayed by Judas. We see Peter's actually called Satan. Whoa. Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," to Peter, his disciple. That's crazy. You wouldn't say that to someone if it didn't happen and put it in the Bible. That's not information you want to put in the Bible. That's pretty embarrassing. You also would not mention women in the story unless it was factually true, because at that point in history, women's testimony in ancient Rome meant nothing. And that's a shame. But this is reality. We have to include the facts as they happened, even if they don't make the disciples look the best. John was called the son of thunder. James and John were. They were Zebedee's sons, but they were called the sons of thunder because of how aggressive they were. And later we find out that John is called a loving disciple. That's a transformation that only God can make. And God makes that transformation because he loves us, because he's given us evidence. And we can reliably look at this evidence and say, oh, it came. It happened. It was real. I do want to mention some historians by name, just in case you're curious. Someone like Sartorius, or Tacitus, or Pliny the Younger. They are all, at some point, mentioning Jesus in their writings. The Jewish Talmud also references Jesus. These are historical events that happened. My faith as a Christian, why am I a Christian? Because it's true. How know it's true? Because of the evidence. What evidence? What happened in the spring of AD 33 is a historical event that, if it is proven to be true, Jesus must be God. And if it can reasonably be proven to be untrue, then Jesus is not God. But I have found no reliable evidence to the contrary that says Jesus is not God. Therefore, I have placed my faith in Jesus, knowing that he is God. And I encourage you to do that as well. As a reminder, all you have to do that is confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, and you will be saved. That is Romans 10:9. If you've never done that, you can just repeat after me in this prayer. Dear God, I am a sinner. Please credit the death of Jesus to my account. I believe that Jesus is Lord, and I believe that you raised him from the dead. In your name I pray. Amen. All right. We're going to have another one of these videos come out in a couple weeks. Keep listening. You will learn more about your faith as I strengthen mine through apologetics and try to remove obstacles that are barriers to faith for other people. Please give me feedback. And as always, questions and comments are more than welcome in these videos. Thanks for watching. Have a great time.